I've got three pieces. Two of them pretty quick. Jerry Bailey raised a concern. He's here today. Yeah, raised a concern about. He did this on the State Journal's website. He hasn't brought this up at a meeting. That raised a concern about the contract we recently signed with KCDC, obligating us to continue making those.
What now?
About the contract that we signed at that we authorized at our last voting meeting, just obligating the city to go ahead and continue making continue covering KCDC's debt service for not just this year but for the next couple of years as well until that debt's paid off, assuming that they can't make the payments themselves. Yeah. And the concern he raised relates to KRS 91A .130 subsection 13 relating to city budgets, which states that no city agency or member, director, officer, or employee of a city agency may bind the city in any way to any extent beyond the amount of money at that time appropriated for the purpose of the agency. All contracts, agreements, and obligations expressed or implied beyond existing appropriations are void. And I was just hoping we could, don't need this right now, but I was hoping we could get an official legal
look at that,
reaction to that.
The contract that was signed actually only dealt with the payments that have already been made, and the resolution, which was a separate document, was a resolution indicating that the payment, if KCDC is unable to pay it in 2012 and 2013, then the city would pay their half of that payment. And of course, resolutions, what one commission resolves, another commission can make a different resolution, but I'll look at that.
Yeah, that's like at state level. I mean, you vote on things there, new group comes in, you don't have to follow through on that.
So it's not a formal obligation.
No, that's right.
I also just would like to recognize that I requested at the last meeting, I requested figures from the Parks Department on part-time employees over the past few years, and we got those numbers and confirmed that there actually was a reduction in the total number of part-time employees within that department a couple of years ago. So that concern of mine was satisfied. Thank you for providing those numbers. I also have a couple of questions about some figures that the Finance Department recently provided us. Commissioner Turner requested, essentially just requested that we see all the money the city has in the different accounts, etc. My understanding is that our reserve fund is currently at $8.5 million. I'm not seeing, and granted, I haven't done full math on all these figures, but I'm not seeing that $8.5 million reflected in the figures we were given. Could you explain where, Steve? Could you explain where in this document that
these funds are set apart from the general fund? These aren't general fund numbers that I gave you on the documents that I submitted. The general fund numbers, the general fund reserve is specifically the amount of money that's left over after all funds have been encumbered and all the payables have been paid. That's just for the general fund. So the numbers I gave Michael and the rest of the commission was all the other funds. So I didn't give the balance sheet for the general fund. Because when Michael and I spoke I spoke to Michael on the phone the other day, he tried to confirm exactly what he wanted. My understanding was at that point, give me all the other funds with the exception of the general fund. So that's what I gave him. Or that's what I gave all the commission. And then I got your request to explain the reserve for the general fund, and that's the explanation I gave Commissioner Wilder for that.
Mr. Turner.
Just a real quick question with regards to the reserve. Well, it's a two-part question. With regards to the reserve fund, has the balance of that reserve fund increased over the last 2 years? And if so, what contributes to that increase in the balance? So if it was at $7 million last year and it's now at 7.5, what has contributed to that
Yes, it has increased over the last year. It went from 7.1 to 8.4. And it increased two factors. And I mentioned this several times in the meetings, but all the managers sitting around this room have reduced their cost about, I can't remember exactly what they reduced it, but it's been average over the last several years about $500,000 or $600,000 that they reduced their cost. That's part of it.
How much was that again?
$500,000 or $600,000 average over the past, 3 or 4 years. And then also, I assume that our revenues were up, over top of what the projections as well. So those two reasons, and I can give you specifics, but that's,
In general.
yeah, in general, that's
So that roughly contributed for $1.3 or $4 million.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Do you anticipate similar increases in this upcoming year or savings?
I anticipate this year we'll have some reserve, yes. Approximately anywhere from, well, if I'm guessing, I'd say $600,000 to $700,000 increase for the year we're in.
Thank you.
Okay.
See, I'm glad all that came up, because I ran a lot of those numbers myself earlier today and confirmed that this is the first time the commission's officially been told that the reserve fund has grown that significantly over the course of the past year. And we keep talking about this, the necessity for this $300,000 in garbage fee that we're being asked to send out here next month. That keeps being referred to in terms of not, in terms of how dangerous it would be to deplete our reserve fund. And we also keep hearing that it would be particularly dangerous to allow our reserve fund to dip below 25% of our annual operating budget. And of course, it's worth noting that the annual garbage fee brings in $600,000 a year. We're being asked to approve essentially one biannual installment of $300,000. So I mean, it's worth noting that that it's just absolutely not true that not sending this bill out would deplete the reserve fund. I mean,
What's not true?
that not sending this bill out would deplete the reserve fund, or would take it down to those levels. In fact, if we don't send out the trash fee, if we don't pull in this $300,000 in July, which I still maintain is absolutely unnecessary, then we would still, even if the reserve fund doesn't grow from this point, and we just heard that we anticipate growth, but even if it doesn't grow from this point, even if it remains stagnant and we actually take $300,000 out, we would still be over, the reserve fund would still be sitting at over 25% of our annual operating budget. It would be sitting at closer to 26% of the annual operating budget. So it's not true that that this would deplete our reserve fund. It would simply, if we hadn't passed it over the past fiscal year, the garbage fee has brought in $300,000 for the city, because there was a lag. There was a lag in there for a while, because at first the garbage fee was billed in advance. Then the previous commission decided to bill it, retroactively, so to speak, and there was a lag in there for that catch-up to happen. So, with the way that played out, this fiscal year, the garbage fund has brought in $300,000, which was not necessary to balance the budget at all. We saw a $1.3 million increase in the reserve fund during that time. If the garbage fee hadn't been passed, then we still would have seen a $1 million increase in the reserve fund. I mean, the idea that passing the garbage fee is necessary to balance the budget or to maintain the reserve fund, it's just not true. Even if we don't pass it now, even if we don't pass this next bill in July, that just means the reserve fund will grow. It'll still grow. It'll just grow $300,000 slower. But we're not talking about depleting it. We're just right now we're actually feeding the reserve fund. And I mean, I realize the reserve fund is valuable, but we've been having this false argument about whether or not we should deplete the reserve fund, and it's been based on a false premise, because nobody actually told us that the reserve fund has been growing. especially this significantly. So I mean, we can discard that idea that this discussion of whether or not we should dip into the reserve fund. The question is, should we add this much to the reserve fund, or should we add this much to the reserve fund? But it's absolutely,
Question. Go ahead, finish it.
Well, but the point just being that it's absolutely unnecessary to pass this, to send this bill out. I mean, even without a backup in place, even if we were to just get rid of it altogether and go on with our lives, it's just not necessary to balance the budget or to maintain the reserve fund.
Okay. The charts that we've seen about reserve fund, I guess it peaked around 2003, 2004, 14 some million.
Yep.
And then it went down four straight years, down to the 4.1 or something. 7.1. Revenue in 2009, whatever. I came in, and you and I came in together, Mr. Wilder, January 2009. The budget that year that we came in on, I think was about 1.8 to 2 million more than the revenue coming in. And so it had to take that from the surplus. Because of some things that two years ago, some action that was taken, which is so unpopular, I think we have to reverse that. And so the chart, I see that, so it has had 2 years of gradual increase. In this period of time, we have not been, from my understanding, we have not been buying equipment, things of this nature, that it seemed to me to get this surplus, we could use that for those kind of items, because we haven't been doing that. Another factor, of course, I was born during the Depression, the Great Depression, and so I know I look at things maybe different than some of y'all do. But if we're on a downward flow, leveled, we start in the last couple of years come back gradually. And there's no way of knowing what's going to happen this next year. But what it seems to me, I mean, I'm just talking about my gut level feeling, because I'm aware of these numbers. I think before we start taking money from the reserve fund, ride this thing out a year. We got the things, I think we've got it going pretty well. This is my personal opinion. And if you have some things like equipment, things of this nature to take from it, I guess it's you take from it, like a one-time thing. That's where I'm comfortable. I'm just saying, y'all, that I am comfortable with what we're doing. And so I have no qualms about just going ahead and doing what we're doing. I think it's defensible.
To clarify, in terms of the $14 million peak in the reserve fund, and I expect Phil can confirm this because he's got the longest institutional memory in terms of the folks sitting around this table. But I've also spoken with Jimmy Rogers, who is Steve's predecessor as finance director. And my understanding is that reserve was built up kind of at Mr. Rogers' behest in anticipation of the public safety building, because Rogers really didn't like, and this is just what he's told me and what I've also understood from talking to folks around here, but Rogers really insisted on paying for things as you go along, as opposed to purchasing things on debt, etc.